Lila sat alone in room 13, the dim light of the desk lamp illuminating a notebook filled with scribbles. She had barely slept the night before after Elias had pulled her away from the terrifying figure in the mist. The ghost's eerie screech still echoed in her head, and Elias's words, "They're hunting," made it impossible to deny the truth. She couldn't deal with what was happening in Ravenswood alone. As much as she hated to admit it, she needed him, the man who had pushed Clara, her friend, into the darkness and might do the same to her. There was a soft knock on the door. Lila stood, opened it, and Elias appeared, dressed in his familiar black coat, his cold blue eyes fixed on her. "Are you ready?" he asked, without beating around the bush. "Ready for what?" Lila frowned, though she knew exactly what he meant. After last night, pretending nothing had happened was impossible. Elias entered the room without waiting for her invitation, closing the door behind him. "For cooperation," he said, his voice even. "You can't deal with them on your own. I'll teach you how to repel them, how to protect yourself. In return, you help me complete the ritual to free Clara." Lila stiffened, her hands clenching. "Free Clara? You want me to help you save your ex?" She couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice. Though there was nothing but strange tension between her and Elias, jealousy welled up uncontrollably. Elias tilted his head, a faint smile playing across his lips. "Clara is no longer my lover. She is a cursed spirit. If we don't free her, she will never leave us alone." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You, Lila, are the key. The spirits react to you more than anyone else." Lila stepped back, feeling his breath on her face. "So I'm just your tool, right? Like Clara was." Elias's eyes darkened, but he didn't respond right away. "If you want to think that, go ahead," he said and turned away, walking to the window to look at the thick fog. "But if you don't cooperate, you won't survive this winter in Ravenswood. It's your decision." Lila bit her lip, struggling with her thoughts. She hated relying on him, but the truth was undeniable. She didn't know how to deal with the spirits, and Elias was the only one who could help her. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "Okay. I'll help you. But on one condition, you have to tell me everything. No secrets, no manipulation. If you hurt me, I swear I won't forgive you." Elias turned back, his eyes softening a little. "I don't promise not to hurt you," he said, his voice low. "But I promise to protect you, no matter what." The words hung between them, and Lila didn't know how to respond. She just nodded, and Elias gestured for her to follow. "We'll start now. Tonight's a good time to practice." They reached a small room in the old building behind the school, one Lila had never been to before. The room was empty, save for a circle drawn in white chalk on the wooden floor, surrounded by half-burned candles. Elias told her to stand in the middle of the circle while he stood outside, holding an ancient book. "The spirits of Ravenswood are drawn to fear," he explained. "To repel them, you must learn to control your fear, to turn it into power." He handed her a small knife, the blade glinting in the candlelight. "Cut your hand? Your blood will be the bridge." Lila hesitated, but then she did, making a small cut on her palm. Crimson blood dripped to the floor, and a cold air surrounded her. Elias began to recite an incantation from the book, his voice low and steady, like a deathly lullaby. Lila closed her eyes, trying to concentrate on his words, but then she heard a whisper, not from Elias, but from something in the darkness. "Her blood, sweet." The whisper echoed in her head. Lila opened her eyes, panicked, and saw a shadowy figure looming in the corner of the room, red eyes staring at her. "Elias!" she shouted, backing away. "Don't be afraid," Elias said, his voice ringing in her ears even as he stood outside the circle. "Look at it. Let it see you're not afraid." Lila trembled but held her ground. She raised her hand, still dripping blood, and shouted, "Go away!" The shadow hissed but did not vanish. It moved closer, and Lila felt a pressure on her chest as if it were sucking the life out of her. Suddenly, Elias stepped into the circle, standing in front of her. He raised his hand, and the shadow growled, backing away. "Enough. he commanded, his voice full of authority. The shadow dissolved into thin air, leaving the room silent. Lila gasped, falling into Elias' arms. He caught her, his hands cold but steady. "You did well," he said, his voice softer than usual. "For a first time, that's good." She looked up at him, and momentarily, she saw a rare flicker of warmth in his eyes. But then he pulled back, releasing her, returning to his usual coolness. "Get some rest. We'll continue tomorrow." When Elias left, Lila sat on the floor, her hands still shaking. She wasn't sure she could trust him completely, but she knew one thing: he had protected her, which made her feel safe, if only a little, in the black mists of Ravenswood. The following day, Lila woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. She didn't dream of the spirit, but her sleep was filled with vague images of Elias, his eyes, his voice, the way he stood in front of her in the circle. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts. Today, she needed to focus. Elias had said they would go to the basement of the old building, where he believed the clue to the curse that bound Clara lay. Elias waited for her in the entryway, holding an old lantern. "The basement isn't safe," he said, not looking at her. "Don't leave me, not even a step." Lila nodded, though she wanted to argue despite him. They descended the rotten wooden stairs, creaking under each step. The air in the basement was cold and damp, and the smell of old earth filled her nostrils. Elias held up the lantern, dimly illuminating the mossy, cobwebbed walls. "What are we looking for?" Lila asked, her voice echoing in the cramped space. "A door," Elias replied. "It's carved with ancient runes. If I'm right, it leads to where Clara is sealed." They walked deeper, and Lila began to feel uneasy. A steady drip sounded from somewhere, but she heard something else, a soft sigh as if someone was standing right behind her. She turned, but there was nothing but darkness. "Elias, do you hear that?" He paused, listening. "Yes," he said, his voice strained. "Don't move." He set the lantern down and pulled a small amulet engraved with a star from his shirt. "It's close." Before Lila could ask more, a cold wind extinguished the lantern. Darkness enveloped them, and the sigh turned to an eerie chuckle. Lila felt an invisible hand touch her shoulder, chilling her to the bone. She screamed, flailing her arms, but Elias pulled her back, holding her close. "Don't panic," he whispered, his breath warm in her ear. He held up the amulet, murmuring an incantation. A faint light emanated from it, and the laughter died away. When the lantern flared back up, they stood before an old wooden door carved with strange symbols. Lila gasped, still leaning against Elias. "What just happened?" "A guardian spirit," he replied, his voice calm again. "It's not attacking, just testing us." He released her, walked to the door, and touched the symbols. "Here it is. We need your blood to open it." Lila looked at him, hesitant. "My blood again? Only you can do it," Elias said, his eyes stern. "I won't force you, but if we don't open it, everything will be for nothing." She sighed, holding out her hand. Elias took the knife, gently making a small incision on her finger. Blood dripped onto the door, and the characters glowed, emitting an eerie red light. The door shuddered, then slowly opened, revealing a deeper staircase. Elias looked at her, a hint of worry in his eyes. "Do you still want to continue?" Lila pursed her lips, nodding. "I'm not stopping now." They walked down, not knowing what awaited them below. But a new feeling was stirring in Lila's heart. As much as she didn't want to admit it, Elias' presence was becoming the only thing keeping her grounded in the darkness. Lila huddled in the corner of her dorm, the dim light from her desk lamp illuminating a Ravenswood history book she'd borrowed from the library. The old pages told of the school's dark past, a forgotten cemetery, 18th-century rituals, and cursed souls who could never be released. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as she read of rituals that required blood and sacrifice. What Elias had told her about Clara, about her death in the basement, began to flash before her. He knew more than he was letting on, and she decided she wouldn't let him keep it a secret today. Gothic Literature class started at 3 in the afternoon, and Lila arrived early, sitting by the window so she could watch Elias as he entered. The room was cold, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and the dampness from the stone walls. Elias showed up on time, his long black coat billowing behind him, his deep blue eyes scanning the students like a razor blade. He had no books, just a black pen, and began the lesson without much preamble. "Today we're talking about betrayal in literature," he said, his deep voice echoing in the silence. "Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon out of hatred. But what motivated betrayal? Was it greed or fear?" Lila felt the blood rush to her face. She raised her hand, not waiting for him to call her. "Professor," she said, her voice firm but slightly trembling, "is betrayal justified? What if someone betrays another to save themselves?" Elias paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. A faint smile crossed his lips as if he knew what she was getting at. "Ms. Voss," he replied, stepping down from the podium, "justification depends on the storyteller. The betrayer may see it as survival. The betrayed only sees pain." "And what about Clara?" Lila blurted out, unable to contain herself. A murmur ran through the room as the other students turned to look at her. "You betrayed her, didn't you? In that ritual?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. Elias stood still, his grip on the pen so tight his knuckles turned white. "You want to discuss personal matters in class, Ms. Voss?" he asked, his voice cold but strangely pressing. "I want the truth," Lila replied, rising from her chair. "You said I was the key but didn't say why Clara died. What did you do to her?" Elias stepped closer, so close she could smell the sandalwood on him. "Sit down," he commanded, but Lila didn't move. He turned to the classroom, shouting, "Today ends early. Get out, everyone." The students filed out, leaving Lila and Elias in the empty room. When the door closed, he turned back to her, his eyes dark. "You don't know when to stop, do you? I won't stop until you tell me the truth," Lila growled, stepping forward to face him. "Who is Clara to you? Why did she die?" Elias fell silent, then suddenly grabbed her hand, pulling her into a corner hidden behind a bookshelf. He pressed her against the wall, his hand clutching her wrist. "You want to know?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Clara was everything to me. I loved her, so much I was blinded. We thought we could break the curse, but when everything fell apart I let her die. I didn't have the strength to save her." Lila felt her heart constrict. She wanted to push him away, but the pain in his voice held her back. "So why did you drag me into this?" she asked, her voice low. "Because I can't let you go," Elias replied, his eyes wavering. "You're stubborn, curious, like her. But I don't want you to end up like Clara. I'm not worth your trust, Lila." She looked at him, and in a moment of impulse she said, "I'm not afraid of you." The words cut through the silence like a knife, and Elias leaned down and kissed her forehead. They were both stunned, and he pulled back immediately as if he'd done something unforgivable. "Go," he said, turning away. "Before I do something I'll regret." Lila left the room, her heart pounding. But she didn't return to the dorm. She went to the library to find out more about Clara. In an old book, she discovers a letter tucked between the pages, in Clara's handwriting. "Elias is my light, but that light is burning me." Lila hugs the letter, feels strange empathy for Clara, and realizes that Elias is not only dangerous but also deeply wounded.